Bonjour tout le monde. This is Gascon en Exil with Divertissement, an extension of my long-running blog. And on that blog, you guys really want me to dig into bad fandom takes. Petty negativity is one of the pillars of the internet alongside porn and cute animal videos, so I shouldn't be too surprised. But even so, this is a topic that's given me my share of fun and headaches over the last 2 years, so it's only fitting that my audience would get to share in the fun, for lack of a better word. I am, of course, referring to Fire Emblem Three Houses, or more specifically, the fandom that's grown up around the game since it was released back in the summer of 2019. In a development that was as natural as it was inevitable, the fanbase for Three Houses has been a divided one since the beginning, broken up just like the student body of the Garreg Officers Academy, after the time skip when they're all trying to kill each other, that is. For better or worse, it's been that kind of, to put it politely, lively online debate that's kept interest in the game alive in the absence of any new content for over a year, or indeed any substantial FE content at all apart from the Gotcha Hell of Heroes, also the Shadow Dragon Switch port. Anyone remember that? Of course, the writing and structure of Three Houses has led to quite a few interesting interpretations of the game's canon. It may be my favorite game in the series to date, but even I'm willing to admit that consistency and clarity of writing are not among its strong suits. The four-root setup outright encourages a selective access to information, but throw in a few layers worth of unreliable narrators, a school mystery plot smashed together with a series-typical war story, and the artificially centralizing force of a player self-insert who can bang the whole cast, and you've got a recipe for a multi-sided faction war. Sometimes you have to wonder if that was intentional. Wait, what am I saying? I played World of Warcraft for over a decade, of course it was intentional. Now, I do feel like I'm preaching to the choir here a bit, because as the people who follow me for FE content know, I've got my own biases and my own little niche carved out in the predominantly Dimitri-loving part of the fandom. I've stepped back from a lot of active engagement with discourse in the last year or so, mostly because I felt like I'd run out of new things to say, but I do still want to give a big shout out to my FE mutuals and other bloggers in my orbit who continue to come out with thoughtful meta and analysis of Three Houses, and in many cases have been the ones who brought the bad takes I'm going to talk about to my attention by braving the hostile territory of Twitter and Reddit. You guys have been doing such a great job in the face of some truly inane and offensive opposition, and if this fandom was doomed to devolve into a faction war, I'm confident in saying that I couldn't have picked a more insightful and overall chill faction to be a part of. Quick disclaimer though before we start. I'm not going to be naming any names attached to these bad takes. In most cases, that's because it's hard to attribute them to a single person, but it's also a matter of me not wanting to encourage harassment or anything distasteful like that. Like I said, the writing of Three Houses is absolutely riddled with holes, so no matter what, you're going to have to fall back on headcanon and personal theories to fill in those holes. Some of the methods fans have chosen for that are more obnoxious than others, true, but all the same, this list is purely for entertainment purposes and shouldn't be taken as a personal attack on people who look at the game in a certain way. This is also my personal list, based on what I've read and heard in the fandom and ordered in a way that I believe highlights how damaging these takes have been. Takes that never got a lot of reach won't appear here, so no, Ingrid is a homophobe because she rejects Dorothea and their support line, or that Lorenz is half Dagden because of his hair color and eye shape. The takes I've chosen to talk about today are ones that have come up over and over again, usually in the service of advancing a particular side of the faction war. That said, let's get into Number 5, The Four Evil Generals of Faerghus. As any longtime fan of Fire Emblem will tell you, this series loves to reference itself and reuse concepts and character archetypes. Identifying those archetypes is kind of a whole thing in the fandom, from Christmas-colored cavaliers to teenage girls unusually attached to their older brothers. The developers love that stuff too, and presumably not just because it lets them be lazy with characterization and world building. In an interview, the team behind Three Houses confirmed that Genealogy of the Holy War was their biggest inspiration for the new game, and for anyone who's played that game, the parallels are hard to miss. Probably the biggest of those is that both games feature a charismatic antagonist who aims to conquer the continent as a means of carrying out their vision for the world. Both of them use the title Flame Emperor and ally themselves with a shadowy cult as a means to the end of taking over the world and killing the assortment of playable characters that stand against them. Edelgard's design might borrow from a variety of past Red Emperors, but Arvis is her true spiritual predecessor. For the faction of the fandom that cannot perceive her as a villain, however, that doesn't sit too well. And while some of those got into the series much more recently and don't give a damn about a snobby elitist referencing a never localized 90s game, others have tried to turn the tables. So here we have The Four Evil Generals of Fargus, a reading of Dimitri and his childhood friends that cast them all in the role of the significantly numbered supporting antagonists seen in several other games. The theory goes that in Crimson Flower, fighting for Dimitri and against Edelgard brings out the worst in each of Felix, Sylvain, and Ingrid, and in that way they develop into opponents who mirror the various flavors of past enemy generals. Sometimes Dedue is included here as well, undoubtedly because Crespis Dedue is by far the most memorable part of Crimson Flower Chapter 17's map, but since the logical follow-up to this take is that Dimitri's friends would be happier betraying him, and Dedue will never do that, he tends to get left by the wayside. Now, there's a bunch of little holes in this argument. Past games have never been all that consistent about how many generals there are exactly. Binding Blade has 3, as does Fate's Birthright since you never fight Elise, and Sacred Stones has 6 of them. And then there's the issue that this only really works in Crimson Flower, whereas the Edelgard as Arvis and Hubert as Manfroy readings work on all 4 routes. This is pretty obviously just a shallow attempt to use Effie's love of self-reference against it, spinning the series' tale as old as time on its head, you know. Instead of a blue lord of an invaded nation taking back his country from a red emperor, now the red emperor is ostensibly the good guy and the blue lord and his friends just need to be conquered. I'd almost call it clever if it weren't such a massive stretch in service of the faction war. But even beyond the logical hoops you need to jump through to make this sort of archetypical recasting work, where's the build-up? What truly separates enemy generals from one-off bosses is that they're built up as significant threats across multiple chapters. Crimson Flower barely has enough chapters to develop its 4 separate antagonist factions into vaguely plausible threats to the Empire. Where in the world would it find the time to do the same for 3 characters who could be on Edelgard's side instead? It's got a few highlights, but honestly, cross-house recruiting really does a number on the characterization in this game. Not for Dedue, though, thankfully. But speaking of him, number 4, Dimitri is straight, but Claude is bi? Okay, I promise this one isn't about shipping wars. Not completely, anyway. This take dates back to pre-release, sort of, back when we were all overanalyzing trailer clips and early game footage, and everyone, myself included, noted that Claude takes Byleth's hand in the ball cutscene and had a few featured lines that could be construed as flirty. This got the ball rolling pretty quickly, and not even the subsequent revelation that Claude cannot S-rank male Byleth managed to stop it. Not his dry and political support line with Lorenz, not his limited interaction with Dimitri or other male characters, nothing. Everyone wanted Claude to be bi out of the gate, and so canon be damned, the fandom has declared it so. Now, that I don't have a problem with. I may not see any bi subtext for Claude myself, but I get that he's hot and fun and superficially not nearly as consumed by narrative and fandom drama as the other house leaders, so of course he'd have fans. No, what bugs me here is the paired counterpoint, that Dimitri is the token heterosexual of the leads. In the first place, it's just not true, when neither Dimitri nor Claude can S-rank male Byleth, and yet of the 2 of them, it's Dimitri who has 2 suggestive paired endings with other men who are intimately attached to him. Following in the subtext-heavy tradition of the GBA and Tellius Fire Emblems, Dimitri's relationships with Dedue and Felix are considerably more significant than anything Claude's got going on, and that's not even getting into the argument I made in the past that Azure Moon is a celebration of male love and camaraderie in the face of female treachery. I could do a whole separate episode on that idea. But, as with pretty much all the entries on this list, however, I'm highlighting this take more for the impact it's had in the endless discourse of the fandom. See, certain fans like to approach Three Houses from a political lens that's, not really there. The long and short of it is that Fire Emblem has never been especially interested in making serious political or social commentary, and instead falls back on the reliable and mildly reactionary takes of a lot of popular fantasy. Villains look and act in obvious ways, the story ends with the return of a good king, democracy for all practical purposes doesn't exist and never will, that sort of thing. I don't consider that an inherent problem, particularly when the series writing still does make salient and meaningful points on the level of individual characters. There's a reason that most of us serious meta-writing types consider Azure Moon to be the best written route, because it's familiar territory for Fire Emblem writing and because it firmly centers its protagonist's character arc. However, Take the political statements of Three Houses at face value and then toss in the tendency of modern fandom culture to read your fictional preferences as indicative of your personal beliefs and your sense of morality, and you get stuff like this. Edelgard and Claude are converted into these unambiguous progressive revolutionaries, based half on the beliefs they profess in canon and half on their identities as a bisexual woman and a biracial man who totally should have been bisexual. Come on, guys. Dimitri, by contrast, gets saddled with the conservative straight white man role, defender of organized religion and upholder of the status quo, with every aspect of his being accordingly amplified, dismissed, or twisted around in service of this reading. That naturally includes not only his struggles with mental illness, but his queerness as well, because both of these would place Dimitri on one or more axes of oppression, just like the other leaders. And that complicates the story, maybe even leads people to question the validity of all these other shallow readings of the leaders. So, yeah, it's not just about shipping. Ship whoever you want, that's on you. Have fun with it. Just spare a bit of thought on why Claude is so readily interpreted as bisexual based on such insubstantial evidence, while Dimitri's ample queer subtext is so often dismissed out of hand. 'Cause not to brag, but when it comes to Effie shipping, Lord Knight dynamics are top-tier content for me, and Dimmy flew way past my expectations there. They don't deserve to have their share grave no homoed for the sake of a straw man in a faction war. But moving on to number 3, teacher theory. How could I not include teacher theory on this list? As far as I know, it's the only piece of Three Houses wank notorious enough to have its own name. On the one hand, I feel a bit lazy about talking about it today, because basically everyone who's involved in the fandom has heard of teacher theory already. But again, this list is primarily about reach and effects on the fandom, and there's no question that this take makes the cut. If you somehow had the good fortune never to come across teacher theory, here's the rundown. Remember how I mentioned that a segment of the fanbase really hates the idea of Edelgard being a villain? Teacher theory is an attempt to explain away her actions in the prologue, by claiming her intent was something other than hiring bandits to kill Dimitri and Claude in an ambush. Drawing on a line from Alois about an unnamed third teacher who fled the scene of the attack, and a line from Caspar saying he thought that Yaritza was going to be the one to take the teaching position that ultimately went to Byleth, these fans claim that Edelgard only intended to scare off this teacher and install Yaritza in his place, and that Costas went off script and tried to kill them all because he's either greedy or an idiot. There are various problems with this reading, ranging from the question of what Yaritza could have accomplished as a teacher that he couldn't as a combat instructor, to why exactly we're relying on Caspar to be a reliable source of information when he's clearly not the sharpest knife in the drawer. Even so, this theory gained a ton of traction on Reddit, and then spread outward to other forums of Three Houses discourse, to the point that some people seem genuinely unaware that teacher theory is fanon rather than provable canon. I mean, it probably doesn't help that Reddit isn't the kind of place that uses terms like fanon all that often, or that this is all tied into the larger goal of making Edelgard look better, but still. I mean, it's not the dumbest theory ever, and as I said, this game's writing has a ton of holes in it, so people are going to find ways to fill those in, but come on. Teacher theory exists entirely to fix a problem that isn't really a problem unless you've got a serious issue with the thought that your conquering emperor waifu might be up for a little political assassination on the DL. Unfortunately, though, we are far from done with Edelgard here. Number 2. Everyone ever is a fascist. Alright, before we get into this one, I do have to point out that I'll be delving into some politically darker content here. You can probably guess where this is going, but I just wanted to give everyone a heads up, okay? Now, it's pretty easy to look at Edelgard and her empire and see parallels with a certain real-world fascist regime. The red and black color scheme, the black eagle symbolism, the fixation on the belief that a minority group affiliated with a particular religion secretly runs the world and needs to be eliminated. Yeah, intended that way by the developers or not, it's all rather on the nose, and I don't think you need to spend that much time with the game to come away with that impression. That, however, is not the bad take I'm talking about today. What is, or rather are the plethora of ways in which Edelgard's ardent fandom supporters have attempted to, again, flip the script and convince people that no, it's really everyone else in Three Houses who's actually a fascist and maybe even a Nazi. These takes include the following: that actually it's the Agarthans who are anti-Semitic caricatures based on their appearances and their history as a group driven underground by the evil colonialist Sothis and her children. They perpetuate the medieval anti-Semitic canard of blood libel, the belief that Jewish people kidnapped Christian children to perform blood rituals when they kidnapped Flame. Following on this, Claude commits genocide against the Agarthans by invading their base and killing them all. Hubert is also an anti-Semitic caricature because his pose in the ending tapestry of Crimson Flower resembles the Happy Merchant, a notorious cartoon of a heavily stereotyped Jewish man. The Empire's War is analogous to the French resistance in World War II, somehow. Abyss is a concentration camp where the church sticks all of Fodlan's unwanted and kills them, maybe, I guess? The Nabateans are light-skinned, and the Church of Saros superficially resembles Catholicism, so they aren't real genocide victims. Alternatively, Edelgard persecuting the Nabateans is just the standard fantasy trope of dragon slaying, so it would be hypocritical to condemn her for it. Speaking of hypocrisy, Fodlan is always unified by the end of the game, so this makes all the main characters imperialist, regardless of the events leading up to unification in each instance. In fact, Claude is the most imperialist of them all, because he's an Almiran prince coming to Fodlan and looking to change it from the outside. Yeah, that's like half a dozen terrible takes just by itself. You may also notice that those interpretations are kind of all over the place and don't cohere on any single point, except that Edelgard isn't a fascist, or at least no less of one than the other main characters, or possibly the developers for writing the game the way they did. I feel the need to reiterate my earlier point here about how Fire Emblem as a series is uninterested in making serious political points because of the ludicrous extent to which these takes go to dismiss what was almost certainly intended as little more than abstractly villainous iconography and signposting to indicate that, cutesy waifu moments aside, Crimson Flower is meant to be a villain route. Some people just really can't deal with that. Which, does nobody like villain routes anymore? Crimson Flower is still my second favorite route, and over half of the reason for that is Hubert being such a hammy and terrible person. It's not that outlandish that someone could enjoy a gaming experience where you watch the world burn. Still, the pattern of these takes is pretty clear, so this last one shouldn't be too much of a surprise. Here's number 1, The Legacy of Freudian Demigod. This is one I've been tracking for a long time. I first came across the theory I refer to here as Freudian Demigod about a month after the game released. It goes something like this. Dimitri was sexually attracted to Edelgard from the time that they met as children, and he expressed this attraction by giving her a dagger as an obvious phallic symbol. His psychotic break during the events of the game was the result of Edelgard's betrayal, not just that she was revealed to be working with the group who orchestrated the tragedy of Duscur, but because she spurned any interest in him. Essentially, Dimitri got a really bad case of blue balls and went on a years-long murderous rampage as a result. The final cutscene of Azure Moon is similarly interpreted as Dimitri stabbing Edelgard literally and metaphorically with his lance, if you catch my meaning. Now, sure, this is a stupid take, and if we engage in some psychoanalysis ourselves, it's pretty easy to read some insecurity in it on the part of straight male players reacting against the homosocial undertones of Azure Moon, a means of relating to Dimitri as a man sexually frustrated over a woman not putting out for him, regardless of whether or not that type of frustration is ever present in the text. If that were the end of it, Freudian Demigod would probably still have made this list simply because it's such a cringeworthy stretch, but that wouldn't have been enough to put it at number 1. No, it takes the top spot because it's a harbinger of many, many bad takes to come, all of them directed against fans of Dimitri, the Blue Lions, and Azure Moon. As with virtually every other bit of Three Houses discourse, it wasn't long before bad faith, gender-related interpretations of Dimitri worked their way into the Edelgard versus Dimitri wank juggernaut. Demigod itself fell by the wayside in time, but in the years since release there's been a slew of transparent takes on Dimitri's alleged violence against women, including a line where Dimitri expresses remorse over killing women and children not only gave us a meme, he not just kills but murders women, but it was twisted into the belief that Dimitri raped women as well. His line in Crimson Flower about the Blaiddyd line continuing after his death got interpreted as him arranging a marriage with a woman during the time skip, specifically to have a crest baby, even though there's no indication that he has either a wife or a child. The legitimate problems with Fargus's chivalric ideals that the game explores through various characters got exaggerated into Fargus being essentially run by toxic masculinity, which supposedly justifies Edelgard conquering the kingdom and also absolves her of being a villain in Azure Moon, because in reality, she's the victim of Dimitri's cultural need for, quote, brutal masculine retaliatory violence, end quote. This all eventually turned directly onto Dimitri's fans, who've been accused of being entirely women, quote, thinking with their ovaries, end quote, who only like him because they're attracted to abusers and want to fix a bad boy. The thought that Dimitri might have male fans, like yours truly, or just anyone who doesn't project themselves onto Dimileth, apparently doesn't occur to these fans. Wow. That's a lot. But, while we are talking about projection, it's not like it's hard to see some of that going on here, too. It is impossible to ignore that Edelgard is the waifu of Three Houses. She and Byleth express romantic interest in each other in all four routes, and she's the only leader who does so regardless of Byleth's gender, meaning that romance can more easily be scripted into the main story instead of being walled off in supports like that sort of content usually is. There's nothing inherently wrong with a video game character scripted to be a love interest for a player's self-insert, but as the frequent mood whiplash of Crimson Flower demonstrates, it doesn't play well with villainy that's intended to be broadly sympathetic. And neither of those elements of Edelgard's character really align with the image of a strong, solitary female revolutionary out to change the world for the better, leaving people who like Edelgard to have basically no choice but to reckon with some major inconsistencies and tonal dissonance. Three Houses has some very flawed writing in places, sure, and it's only natural for fans to want to improve that writing where it concerns characters and plots they care about. But when they instead take criticisms of their fave as personal attacks and then turn around and make actual personal attacks on everyone else in the fandom, it becomes a serious issue, not to mention a breeding ground for these kinds of awful and poorly thought out takes. That said, though, I think my biggest problem with most of the takes I've discussed today is how obvious they are about perpetuating a fandom faction war, even as they claim to be about making serious social and political statements. Because honestly, as strongly anti-Edelgard as I'm sure this list has come off, I don't actually hate her character. The heavy centering of Edeleth would only grate on me if I treated Byleth as a self-insert. And for what it's worth, I think that with clearer and more committed writing, Edelgard could have made for an interesting villain. She probably wouldn't have been one of my favorites, but I still would have appreciated the effort. Yeah, as long as Hubert still got to be as evilly awesome as ever, that is. Whew. Alright. That about does it for my bad takes list and for today's episode. Let me know what you guys think, and if you've seen any takes worse than the ones I've talked about today. I enjoy getting to talk about Three Houses and fandom drama in a new way, and I appreciated this opportunity as a learning experience for more structured podcasts, not to mention longer ones, considering this is over twice the length of any of my previous episodes. I would like to thank, as always, all my patrons for making this possible, and thank you to everyone else who expressed interest in this project and listened in. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you in the next episode.